Mr. President, I am rising now to respond to a statement that was made by our good friend from Illinois a few minutes ago, and to clarify it. It's kind of interesting that we look back and we find that when the Republicans had someone in the White House and the Democrats were trying to block a nomination, it was just the opposite as to what it is today. In fact, I will read you, at that time, the senators in the leadership of the Democrats, Obama, Biden, Clinton, Schumer, and Reid, all made the statement, a joint statement, that the Senate does not have to confirm presidential nominations and urged that the Senate refuse to do so, especially in an election year. Now, it's just the opposite of what the senators said. But you know, I don't blame them. I don't blame any Democrat for trying his best to get a nominee from this president, because as a Democrat, they are more liberal than Republicans are, and they would like to very much to have a chance to change the balance of the United States Supreme Court, who has been consistent in recent years in objecting to some of the extremist left programs. And so I can't blame him for trying, but nonetheless, that's not going to work. And I applaud the leader. At the time that the sad death of Scalia took place, he was in a position where we're in recess, and so he had to make a decision, and the decision was the right decision. And so anyway, I want to share a couple of things with you, Mr. President, that letters that came from my state of Oklahoma. And I will give the names and addresses, and if anyone wants to check, this is what real people, you get outside the Beltway, you get outside of Washington, D.C., and then you go back to states like Oklahoma. This is what concerns that they have. I'm going to read the first one. This one's from a guy named Robert from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Came right after the sad death of Justice Scalia. He said, "Dear Senator Inhofe, I've just learned of the death of Justice Scalia. I should only be feeling sadness at the death of this great patriot, a man of the law, and I'm terrified of what I am sure is now already in the works, his replacement by President Barack Obama. The person who replaces Justice Scalia will have the potential to change the balance of power on the bench for decades and may have the possibility to reshape the political landscape immediately and unalterably. I therefore beg you and all," again, I'm quoting from a letter, Robert from Tulsa, Oklahoma, "I therefore beg you and all of your fellow senators to not vote to affirm any candidate put forward by President Obama. This is an election year, and the people should be given a chance to choose which direction this country will go and not have it decided by President Obama as he leaves the White House. Please do not vote for any candidate offered by this administration." Another letter. This came from Chickasha, Oklahoma. It says from Donald. He says, "Dear Senator Inhofe, I've just received word of the death of Supreme Court Justice Scalia. His death is a loss for the conservative movement, but I fear it also puts our country in peril. With Scalia gone, President Obama will certainly present a nominee for his seat. If it is a justice that holds to Obama's progressive ideals and agenda, it could mean grave danger for our Constitution. I urge you to hold fast and refuse to confirm any Obama appointee to the court. Hold out until he is out of office. I feel the future of our nation depends on it." That's from Donald from Chickasha, Oklahoma. Next from Matthew from Claremore, Oklahoma. Claremore is one of the towns where our famous Will Rogers spent his childhood. And everyone's heard of Will Rogers. Great guy, right, you guys? Anyway, he was, Matthew said, "Dear Senator Inhofe, I'm contacting you in regards to the loss of Justice Scalia and his replacement. Justice Scalia was a brilliant man and a true patriot. Unfortunately, I do not feel any appointee by the president would follow the Constitution and serve with the same virtue as Justice Scalia. I am asking that you and the other members of the Senate do not confirm a new justice until after the election, when the newly elected president can make the appointment. We have sent you to Washington to stop the agenda of the president that runs contrary to the wishes of the country. Please stand on your principles and do not allow the president to appoint another justice that may be detrimental to our freedom and for decades to come. Thank you, and that's Matthew from Claremore, Oklahoma. And let me assure the hundreds of letters that we've received, I've read them, and I'd have no intention of changing the pattern that has been in existence since 1888 and allow a president during an election year to make such a nomination. So I think we did the right thing. I think it would have been inappropriate to say that we're going to have hearings knowing that we were not going to confirm a nominee. I don't think that would be fair to the nominee. These are just a few examples of the hundreds of letters and calls from constituents that I've received asking the Senate that the Senate wait to confirm the next Supreme Court nominee until we have a new president. We've heard from our colleagues and pundits on the other side, the Democrats, the other side of the aisle, that it is our constitutional duty to confirm President Obama's nominations. The Constitution says, and it says very clearly, that the president shall, quote, shall nominate and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate shall appoint judges to the Supreme Court. The Senate clearly has a role in this process, and the Senate can either give its consent or it can withhold its consent and completely fulfill the constitutional duties. So it doesn't make any difference. We have the latitude of making that determination, and we're going to do it. It wasn't long ago when the Democrats were singing a different tune when the Republican was in the White House, and that would have been President Bush at that time. Some of them on the floor, the Democrats, said, quote, the Senate does not have to confirm presidential nominations and urge that the Senate refuse to do so, especially in an election year. Now, that was the Democrats saying that. So it's just the opposite of what they're saying today. In fact, the senators, the leadership who was saying that at the time were none other than Senators Obama, he was a senator at that time, Biden, he was a senator at that time, Clinton, she was a senator at that time, Schumer and Reid. They all made the same statement. They said the Senate does not have to confirm presidential nominations and urged that the Senate refuse to do so, especially in an election year. Now, that's where there is a difference of opinion, because an election year was actually the last time it was done in an election year was 1888. You have to go all the way back to 1888, 128 years before you find a similar situation to the one that we're in today. And that's the last time a vacancy arose during an election year and was filled by the Senate from a party on the opposite side of the president. That's the last time that happened, 1888. And we're not about to change that now. Furthermore, even if this were not true, this president hasn't worked with Congress on much of anything, so why should we work with him on this? But that's not the point. The point is that we don't have to do that, and that when the Senate, when the Democrats were in control of the Senate and Republicans had the White House, they made it very clear. The leadership said the Senate does not have to confirm a presidential nomination, and they urged us not to do it. And so the tables are turned now, and so that's not going to change. Now, why is this important? We've seen time and again that when President Obama is unable to get his liberal agenda through Congress, he's turned to executive actions and to agency rulemaking to implement his priorities. And these regulations and actions are making their way through our courts and are either going to be heard by the Supreme Court or are already heard by the Supreme Court. President Obama's executive amnesty was stayed by the lower courts, and the Supreme Court will decide this term if that injunction will stand out or not. Now, what we're saying is this. The president has a very liberal agenda on almost every social issue, every fiscal issue, every military issue. It's a very liberal agenda. And so when the president can't get things done through legislation, he then turns around and tries to do it through regulation. I'll give you an example. If you talk to the American Farm Bureau right now, they'll tell you that the greatest problems that farmers and ranchers, I know this because I'm from a farm state of Oklahoma, But the greatest problem that they have is not anything that's in the ag bill, it's the overregulation of the EPA. And they single out, of all the regulations that are being damaging to farmers and ranchers in America, the one that is the worst is the WOTUS rule. That's Waters of the United States. Historically, it has always been in the jurisdiction of the states as to how to control and manage the waters of the United States, except in cases where it's navigable waters. Well, we understand that. We understand that's where the federal government should be involved. And so 6 years ago, there's a lot of legislation, and one in particular, one bill that was offered in the House and the Senate that would take the word navigable out. And so that being the case, that would mean that all of the waters, the jurisdiction would go from the states to the federal government. And we weren't going to let that happen. So, but this is what is going on right now. Things they've tried to get passed through legislation. They haven't been able to do it. They're trying to do it through regulation. Now, if the Supreme Court is split 4-4 in these two cases that I just mentioned, the injunctions of the lower courts will stand until the underlying issue issues are fully litigated, and that's what they're waiting for right now. The courts have said until the litigation is cleared up, we're not going to act on this rule. Well, as you know, that's going to take a long time for that to happen. The Clean Power Plan, now that's the other one. You might remember, to give you a little background, Mr. President, going back to about 2000, the year 2000. That's when all this global warming stuff started, and the end of the world was coming, and so they were introducing legislation at that time to have cap and trade to try to regulate the emissions of CO2 throughout America. And when people realized how much that cost and the fact that the science was not yet settled, it was defeated. Every time they brought it to the United States Senate, it was defeated. And I'm talking about through legislation trying to do a cap and trade in America. And one of the interesting things was the first director of the EPA that was appointed by this president was Lisa Jackson, and I asked her a question when it was on the record live on TV. I said, you know, if we were to pass either this legislation for cap and trade or do it by regulation in the United States, would that have the effect of lowering the emissions of CO2 worldwide? And she said no, because this isn't where the problem is. The problem's in China, the problem's in India, the problem's in Mexico. And so that was we went through that whole thing. And so the president, when he came in office, decided, well, they're never going to pass this by elected representatives of the people. So we'll do it by regulation. So he came out with the Clean Power Plan. The Clean Power Plan is what President Obama came up with that essentially does the same thing as legislation would do when it would perform cap and trade for the states. And we remember about the trip to Paris. When he got to Paris and was unable to get anyone to do anything, you know, the deal they came up with is kind of humorous because China said, no, we're going to continue our emissions until 2025. And at that time, we'll start lowering our emissions as if they were going to do it. They're not going to do it. But nonetheless, that was the Clean Power Plan came up, was essentially the same thing that was killed by legislation. The Clean Power Plan would cost about $292 billion in mandates, carbon dioxide cuts from the power sector that meet his standards. And he said this in Paris, President Obama, that we're going to lower our CO2 emissions between 26 and 28% by 2025. Now, he never would say how he's going to do that, never did say how we were going to comply with that, but nonetheless, he was going to try to do it. And obviously, that was something that would not have worked. These and the other executive actions and regulations will have a big impact on our people and our economy, and will all likely be decided by the Supreme Court. And that's where we get back to the Supreme Court. The Clean Power Plan would be then decided. And right now, the Clean Power Plan, there is a stay in the United States Supreme Court on the Clean Power Plan until all of the litigation that is pending right now can be settled. And that could be a long time, certainly more than way past this particular presidency. It's not just the executive actions at stake, it's the moral direction of our country too. Just last week, The Supreme Court heard a case challenging the state of Texas on its new abortion regulations that require that clinics meet the standard of other outpatient surgical clinics and mandate that abortion doctors have admitting privileges at nearby hospitals. That's the Supreme Court. That's the type of thing that you would see if the liberals would have their way and if the Supreme Court would change its direction. Many of these decisions are 5-4 decisions, and that's why I say this is the swing decision. It's the American people who will bear the burden of these decisions, and therefore they should have a say in who would fill Justice Scalia's vacancy. So this decision should be made by the next president, and let a new president decide who should replace Justice Scalia, and that's exactly what's going to happen. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.